After Philippon's death, a young king rose from blood and ruin, Alexander of Macedon.
He crossed the ancient sea, claiming Asia as spear-won land, and marched toward Persia.
At the River Granicus, satraps and mercenaries gathered, their horsemen outnumbering his, the first shield of Darius raised. Advised to wait for dawn, he chose instead to gamble everything on one furious charge.
The first wave bled in the currents of the Granicus, tearing open the Persian line.
Then Alexander struck like a living spear, facing death blade to blade, saved in the last heartbeat as his companions shattered the satrapal horse.
This was only the first blow.
After his uncertain enthronement in 336 BC, a 20-year-old Alexander the Great moved with ruthless clarity. He eliminated rivals, broke hostile factions at court, and bound powerful Macedonian nobles to his cause. A kingdom shaken by the murder of Philip II was dragged back under firm royal control. Once power at home was secure, Alexander did not sit still. He campaigned north, south, and west, forcing cities and tribes to submit. The loudest warning came in late 335 when Thebes rebelled. Alexander answered with fire and steel. Thebes was stormed, its walls leveled, its houses burned, many of its people killed or sold. The ruins told all Greece what would happen to those who defied the new Argead king. With his borders quiet, Alexander turned to the dream that had filled his imagination since boyhood. Taught by Aristotle and steeped in the Homeric epics, he measured himself against Achilles and other heroes. To win such glory, he would look east. Beyond the Hellespont lay the Achaemenid Empire, a 3-century-old giant that dwarfed Macedon in land and wealth, almost 50 times larger than his own realm, yet now marked out in his mind as prey. He meant to strike that empire with the weapon forged for him by Philip II, a professional army built for speed and shock. This was no loose tribal warband and no fragile league of jealous cities. It was a standing force drilled to move as one, able to march far, hit hard, and win quickly. Alexander had sharpened it further with his own taste for risk and sudden blows. Here begins his road to the first great clash with the forces of Darius III at the River Granicus. The young king is always searching for a single decisive battle, a stroke that will change the fate of empires and carve his name into memory. Before crossing into Asia, Alexander summoned the Macedonian magnates to Pella. In the royal palace, he set out his plan to carry the war across the sea. His older advisors spoke with the caution of men who had seen many campaigns. They urged him to take a wife before he sailed, to father an heir so that the dynasty would not end if he fell on some distant field. Alexander refused. Whether from political calculation or a cool interest in women, he chose risk over safety and the present campaign over future security. The treasury posed another hard problem. A year of constant marching and fighting had almost emptied the royal coffers. The armor of the companions still shone bright, but the gold behind it was gone. To fund the invasion, Alexander turned to the men around him. He divided large sections of the Macedonian crown lands and granted estates so that each companion would be provided for. The polished story says that Perdiccas asked what he would keep for himself. Alexander answered with 2 simple words: "My hopes." Behind the proud phrase lay a cold fact. He was borrowing from the future and staking everything on victory in Asia. Once the council in Pella ended, the army began to move east. Alexander, his companions, and the invasion force marched through Macedonia and Thrace, following the same route that Xerxes the Firm had used in 480 BC to bring a Persian host into Greece. Now, a century and a half later, a Macedonian king retraced that road in the opposite direction. Antipater stayed behind as regent, charged with holding Macedonia and keeping Greece quiet, while Alexander gambled abroad. After about 20 days on the road, covering hundreds of miles of hills, rivers, and dusty tracks, the army reached the narrow peninsula of the Chersonese. There they prepared to cross the Hellespont into Asia. The crossing showed the blend of hard realism and theater that marked Alexander's style. Parmenion, his most trusted general, took charge of the main work. Using around 160 triremes of the Hellenic League, he ferried the bulk of the army from Sestos to Abydos in an orderly, unopposed passage. Alexander chose a different route. With a small escort, he sailed south to Elaeus and crossed from there instead. One tradition says that as his ship neared the Asian shore, the king stood in full armor, lifted a spear, and hurled it into the sand. By that act, he claimed the land beyond as spear-won territory. The gesture came straight from epic poetry, but it also sent a clear message. The war ahead would be decided by force of arms, not by compromise. Once ashore, Alexander sacrificed to the gods and made a pilgrimage to Troy. On the windy plain, where Achilles and Hector were said to have fought, he honored the heroes whose stories had shaped his ambition. He compared their age with his, walked among supposed tombs, and cast himself as the new champion of the Greeks, come to punish a great Eastern power. Only after this did he ride north to rejoin the main army near the town of Arisbe. On the plain near Arisbe in 334 BC, he reviewed the force with which he planned to carve into the Achaemenid Empire. In raw numbers, it was small beside the masses Persia could gather, but it was sharper and more flexible. At its core stood the Macedonian heavy infantry, organized into the phalanx, with phalangites braced behind long sarissa pikes. Beside them waited the elite hypaspists, called shield-bearers or guards in the sources, able to fight like traditional Greek hoplites, or to loosen their formation when the ground turned rough. Behind this corps stood allied hoplites from the cities of the Hellenic League, and bands of mercenaries whose pay came from Macedonian gold rather than Persian silver. Light troops screened the line. Archers, javelin men, and the Agrianians, mountain skirmishers, later nicknamed Gurkhas of the ancient world. Together, these foot soldiers gave Alexander an army that, though not huge, could adapt to many different fields and enemies. His mounted arm was even more famous. At its heart rode the Hetairoi, the Companion Cavalry, nobles who served as both elite shock troops and the king's closest followers. Alexander so often led their charges in person that horse and rider together became a living spearhead aimed at the enemy line. Philotas, another son of Parmenion, commanded these squadrons. Alongside them rode the Thessalian cavalry and lighter horsemen from Thrace, Paeonia, and the Greek cities. On paper, Persian cavalry might outnumber this force, but in drill, armor, and cohesion, Alexander's horsemen had the edge. Behind the battle line marched the people who made long-distance war possible: siege engineers and sappers, surveyors, clerks under Eumenes of Cardia, and scholars eager to see lands that still felt half-legendary. Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes went as the king's official historian, ready to turn each day's march into a story for the wider Greek world. When the army was ready, Alexander marched east toward the satrapal capital of Hellespontine Phrygia, Decilium. He did not take every unit with him. Many League hoplites and mercenaries were left behind, perhaps because he feared their loyalty if they faced other Greeks fighting for Persian pay. With his Macedonian infantry and the full strength of his cavalry, he advanced in good order. Looting and burning were forbidden. This, he told his men, was Greek land under foreign occupation, not some barbarian wilderness to be ravaged for sport. As the Macedonian host pushed deeper into Asia, word of its advance spread. In the western provinces of the Achaemenid Empire, satraps and generals began to gather, and Memnon of Rhodes rode to advise them. In the next part of our story, their council at Zelea will shape the Persian response and lead both armies toward the river called the Granicus. By the time the sun began to sink over the Granicus, Asia Minor would lie open before Alexander. But that future turned on a single council of war held far away at Zelea. There, in May 334 BC, the western satraps of the Achaemenid Empire gathered to decide how to deal with the young Macedonian king who had dared to cross the Hellespont. Arsames, Spithridates, Arsites, and other governors arrived with their retainers, joined by Memnon of Rhodes, the seasoned Greek mercenary commander to whom Darius III had given rich estates. Around them stretched a province that had known Persian rule for generations, its fields and towns now at risk. Memnon saw the danger clearly. He knew what Alexander's army could do once it found firm ground and room to maneuver. The Macedonian phalanx ground forward like a moving wall. Its long sarissa pikes kept enemies at bay. The hypaspists could plug gaps and hold broken terrain. The cavalry, especially the hetairoi, struck like a hammer when a weak point opened. Facing that machine in a straight battle, on terms chosen by Alexander, was asking for disaster. So Memnon urged a different course. He advised the satraps to deny battle. Let the Macedonians march into emptiness, burn the crops, destroy fodder, taint the wells, pull back the people. Use the Persian navy to open a second front in Greece. With no supplies and no secure base in Asia, Alexander would be forced to hurry back across the sea, mocked as a rash invader who had overreached himself. It was a brutal plan, but it fit the realities of war. The satraps balked. Scorched earth meant ruining their own provinces and admitting weakness in front of their subjects. Some of them distrusted Memnon, a Greek upstart raised high by Darius's favor and gifted estates inside their territories. Others feared that if they avoided direct combat, the great king would brand them cowards and strip them of power. Their sense of honor as Persian nobles and their personal pride pulled in the same direction. Better to fight and risk death than to torch their own lands and invite suspicion. Whatever their private thoughts, they rejected Memnon's advice and chose instead to gather their cavalry and Greek mercenary infantry and march west. Alexander would be met in the field and thrown back into the sea. It was a decision born from honor, politics, and fear of the king's displeasure, and it would shape the first clash with the Macedonians. Meanwhile, Alexander was on the move. After leaving Arisbe, he drove his smaller, more mobile army along the Hellespontine coast, through places like Percote and Lampsacus. He advanced as if on parade, keeping his forces in a formation that could easily turn from marching order into battle line. The baggage came behind, the phalanx in the center, cavalry and light troops screening the flanks and riding ahead as scouts. The land he crossed was, in his eyes, Greek territory held by foreign masters. He reminded his soldiers that they were liberators as much as conquerors. Looting and burning were forbidden. Fields and villages were to be left untouched. In a cunning twist, Alexander ordered that the private properties of Memnon of Rhodes be treated with special care. By sparing the estates of one of the most dangerous enemy commanders, he hoped to sow doubts about Memnon's loyalty in Persian minds. At last, the Macedonian columns reached a broad plain where a winding river cut through the landscape. This was the Granicus, shallow in places but edged by steep banks. As Alexander halted to dress his line in a standard deployment, his scouts galloped back with urgent news. A Persian army was drawn up on the far side of the river. He moved forward to see for himself. Across the water, on the higher eastern bank, he could make out long lines of cavalry glittering with spears and scale armor, drawn up almost at the lip of the slope. There were roughly twice as many Persian horsemen as he had, drawn from many provinces of the empire. On their flanks stood noble contingents from places like Paphlagonia, Hyrcania, Bactria, Media, all eager to show their courage before the great king's messengers. Somewhere further back, beyond immediate sight, was a compact body of Greek mercenary hoplites, hired to act as the heavy infantry corps. Alexander responded quickly. He ordered the phalanx to form in the center, 6 taxis in a solid block, with the hypaspists anchored on the right. To their side he placed the Companion Cavalry, himself and Philotas at their head, with agile Agrianians and archers close by. On the left, under Parmenion, stood the Thessalian cavalry and other allied horsemen, ready to hold that wing. The line angled slightly, so that his own right, where he would lead, pushed closer to the strongest part of the Persian array. Once the army was in place, Parmenion rode over to the king. The old general had fought under Philip II and knew what it meant to cross a defended river. He warned Alexander that an immediate attack would mean pushing men and horses up from a slippery riverbed into a wall of enemy spears and javelins. Any stumble, any hesitation, might turn the crossing into a slaughter. If they waited until dawn, he argued, the Persians might withdraw during the night, rather than face Macedonian infantry on level ground. Then the army could cross in safety and fight later on better terms. Alexander listened, but his mind was already set. To delay felt like fear. To fall back from the river would lift Persian spirits and perhaps embolden rebels in Greece who were watching every move. His own nature, fed on stories of heroes like Achilles, pushed him toward bold action. He chose to attack at once. The Granicus would be taken in a single rush, or not at all. The Macedonian king prepared a first thrust. He sent a mixed vanguard down into the river, light cavalry, Paeonian horsemen, some of the prodromoi, a handful of companions, and his beloved Agrianians. Their official task was to secure a foothold on the far bank. In truth, they were also bait. Alexander wanted to draw part of the Persian cavalry away from their advantageous position on the ridge. As the advance force splashed into the Granicus, the danger became clear. From the high opposite bank, Persian horsemen unleashed a storm of missiles. Spears, javelins, and arrows rained down on men and animals trying to climb up through mud and water. Many fell before even reaching the crest. Others were forced into confused hand-to-hand combat in the riverbed itself when Persian units charged down to meet them at close quarters. The fighting grew intense and costly. The vanguard suffered heavy losses, but their sacrifice achieved its hidden purpose. Bit by bit, more Persian squadrons moved down off the bank and into the river, eager to finish off the intruders. The neat line on the ridge began to warp and break up into pockets of struggling riders. At that moment, Alexander struck with his full weight. He formed the Companion Cavalry into a wedge and led them obliquely into the river, slightly to the right of the battered vanguard. There, the Persian resistance was thinner. Hooves churned through water and gravel as the heavy horsemen fought the current and scrambled up the far slope. Once they had gained some sort of order on the enemy side, Alexander turned left and drove straight into the exposed Persian wing in the riverbed, where many of their commanders were fighting. What followed was a brutal cavalry battle fought almost like an infantry clash. Horse pressed against horse, man against man, shields smashing, lances thrusting, the noise of iron and shouting echoing along the river. The Macedonians used their stout Xyston lances of cornel wood to deadly effect, while Persian lances and spears, lighter and shorter, proved less effective in the crush. In the chaos, Alexander became the focus of desperate efforts to kill him. His bright armor and white-plumed helmet marked him out. At one point his spear snapped, and he had to take a fresh one from a bodyguard. Riding ahead with only a small knot of companions, he speared a noble identified as Mithridates, Darius's son-in-law, in the face. A heartbeat later, another Persian, Rusaces, closed in and slashed through part of the king's helmet before being killed in turn. While Alexander struggled with Rusaces, yet another enemy, Spithridates, satrap of Lydia, circled in from behind. He raised his sword for a killing blow at the back of the Macedonian king's head. At the last instant, Cleitus the Black, one of Alexander's senior officers, spurred forward and swung his weapon with all his strength, severing Spithridates' arm at the shoulder. The sword dropped harmlessly, and Alexander lived to fight on. All along the right wing, the tide was turning. Companion squadrons hacked deeper into the Persian ranks, and the Agrianians darted in among enemy horses, hurling javelins at close range. On the opposite flank, Parmenion held firm against charges by Bactrian and Median cavalry, refusing to be rolled up while the king broke through. In the center, the phalanx and hypaspists began to push across the river, their advance slow but steady, shrugging off missile fire as they climbed. Under the weight of these combined attacks, the satrapal cavalry line started to collapse. Units that had ridden down into the river now found themselves pressed back toward the bank and then beyond it, their first advantage lost. Some noble contingents chose to fight to the last in the water. Others, including Memnon of Rhodes, used their mobility to disengage and withdraw toward cities like Miletus. The Macedonian right had smashed a hole in the Persian army. What Alexander did next with that opening, and how he treated the Greek mercenaries who still stood unbloodied behind the river, would cast a long shadow over the rest of his campaign. With the Persian cavalry reeling at the Granicus, the fate of the Greek mercenaries and of all Asia Minor hung in the balance. While Alexander was carving a bloody path through the satrapal horse, a solid block of Greek mercenary hoplites still stood some distance behind the river under a commander named Omares. They had been hired to be the rock in the Achaemenid line, a dense forest of spears meant to meet any infantry charge. Yet when the cavalry fight exploded sooner than expected and the battle swung back and forth along the riverbed, they remained strangely apart, watching dust and flashes of bronze on the far bank. The speed of Alexander's assault robbed them of the calm time needed to march forward in proper order. By the moment they fully understood that the satrapal cavalry was collapsing, the tide had already turned. As the Macedonian phalanx and hypaspists finally forced their way across the Granicus, they shook out their ranks on the far side, sarissæ leveled and shields locked. To either side of this bristling wall, Alexander's cavalry wheeled out like wings. On one flank rode the companions who had just smashed the Persian left. On the other, Parmenion's horsemen, tired but unbroken, pressed in. Between these powerful arms stood the Greek mercenaries, now alone on the field and outnumbered. A force hired to support Persian power suddenly found itself the only barrier between Alexander and the open road into the interior. Realizing how desperate their position had become, the mercenaries tried words before weapons. They sent envoys and called out for terms. In their eyes, Alexander was not just an invader, but a fellow Greek king. They hoped he would see them as men who had simply chosen a different paymaster, not as traitors to some grand national cause. If he allowed them to surrender, they could lay down their weapons, perhaps enter his service, or at least be sent home alive. Alexander's answer was steel. He refused their appeal and ordered a full attack. The Macedonian cavalry closed in from both sides, tightening the noose, while the phalanx advanced from the front like an iron gate swinging shut. Trapped in a shrinking space, the mercenaries did what veteran hoplites had always done. They set their shields, lowered their spears, and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. For a time, the fighting was savage and close. Macedonian horses could not easily push into dense ranks of armored infantry, and many of Alexander's men fell in the attempt. In this grim second phase of the battle, the Macedonians may have taken more losses than during their dramatic charge across the river itself, yet weight and numbers told in the end. The long pikes of the phalanx, pushing steadily forward, began to pierce the enemy front rank. The pressure from the flanks tore at the mercenaries' cohesion. Eventually, their line buckled and broke into small, isolated knots of spearmen. Each of these pockets was surrounded and cut down in turn. Only a few managed to cut a path out and flee. The rest died where they stood. Ancient writers later argued over Alexander's motives. Plutarch claimed that rage played a large part, that the king was driven more by anger than cold reason when he ordered this harsh example. But there was also a calculated message in the slaughter. By killing so many Greek mercenaries in Persian service and sending the survivors away in chains, Alexander was saying to the wider Greek world, "If you take foreign gold to fight against me, you will have no mercy." Around 3,000 of these men lay dead on the field when the work was done. Another large group, enough to fill a town, was marched off in shackles to labor in Macedonian mines for the rest of their lives. On the Persian side, the cavalry had also paid a heavy price. A significant share of the 10,000 horsemen who had lined the far bank that afternoon never rode again. Among the dead were almost a dozen high-ranking officers and satraps, men whose names carried weight across the empire. The satrapal army that had once stood so proudly on the ridge above the Granicus now lay scattered, its survivors riding hard for distant strongholds such as Miletus. Macedonian casualties, by contrast, were much lower, though not light to those who counted friends among the fallen. Ancient figures speak of a loss in the low hundreds of cavalry and only a few handfuls of phalangites. Even if those numbers were softened by propaganda, the difference in scale between Persian and Macedonian losses is clear. Strategically, the result could not be disguised. In a single hard hour beside a small Anatolian river, Alexander had shattered the first serious attempt to block his way. When the killing stopped, Alexander turned from victor to mourner. He went among the wounded, praised their courage, and promised care for those who had lost limbs and eyes. He ordered that the Macedonian dead be buried with honor, and that their names be recorded so families back home would know how they had fallen. In a gesture meant to win respect even from enemies, he also granted proper burial to many Persian nobles who had died bravely in the fight. A trophy was raised on the battlefield, a visible sign that the gods had been witness to a great victory. With the field secured, Alexander began to shape the political map behind his marching line. He appointed a new satrap over Hellespontine Phrygia, a man loyal to Macedon, but instructed to preserve existing local structures wherever possible. The message was that Persian rule could be replaced without tearing apart every familiar pattern of life. Taxes would still be collected, judges would still sit, but the ultimate master had changed. He then moved quickly to exploit the psychological shock of his triumph. Zelea, the city near which the Persian council had once met, was taken but pardoned. Rather than make an example of it as he had with Thebes, Alexander chose mercy. The people of the town would be more useful alive and obedient than dead or enslaved. From there he sent Parmenion ahead with a fast-moving column to seize Decilium, the former satrapal capital. Its garrison, hearing news of the disaster at the Granicus, had already abandoned it. The city fell without a struggle. The real prize lay further south. As Alexander advanced, he drew near to Sardis, one of the great centers of Persian power in Asia Minor, with a treasury that had helped feed the empire's armies for generations. Before he even reached the city walls, the commander of the garrison, and many leading citizens came out to meet him. They offered to surrender Sardis, its fortress, and its wealth without resistance. The fall of such a stronghold, without a single ram striking its gates, showed just how deeply the shock of Granicus had cut. Standing on the Acropolis of Sardis, looking over the land that had once been part of the Lydian and then the Persian realm, Alexander could measure how far he had come in a very short time. In 336 BC, his position at home had been fragile. Macedon had trembled when Philip II was killed. The Greek cities had watched closely, wondering whether the young king would falter. Now, barely 2 years later, he had broken a satrapal army in open battle and occupied one of the grand urban jewels of the ancient Near East. Yet even as he offered sacrifice to Zeus and other gods in thanks, Alexander must have known that this was only the opening act. The empire he had struck was not a brittle shell, but a vast, layered structure stretching far beyond the horizon. Deep in its heart, far to the east of Sardis, the great king Darius III was beginning to gather a royal army on a scale the Macedonians had not yet faced. The next time Alexander met Persian forces, it would not be satraps and hired Greeks standing in his path, but the King of Kings himself, leading a host that could darken the plain. From Sardis, the trail of Alexander's first great victory stretched outward in many directions, across Asia Minor, back to Greece, and deep into the heartland of the Persian king. News of the battle at the Granicus raced ahead of the Macedonian columns. Traders carried it along dusty roads. Ship captains repeated it in every harbor. The story changed with each telling. Some spoke of a narrow escape, of the young king almost cut down on the riverbank. Others told of a flawless triumph, as if the gods themselves had stood in the Macedonian ranks. What mattered was the core truth. A small but disciplined army from the north had smashed the first Persian shield raised against it. Alexander understood how to turn that fact into a weapon. He sent envoys and letters back across the sea, not just to Macedon, but to the cities of the Hellenic League. They carried word that the Pan-Hellenic War against Persia, begun under Philip II, was now truly underway. The dead at the Granicus were presented as martyrs in a righteous cause. Their names would be inscribed, their families honored. The message was simple. The campaign was not robbery, but vengeance and liberation. One gift in particular carried huge symbolic weight. From among the spoils, Alexander selected hundreds of pieces of captured Persian armor, mail, helmets, gleaming shields. He sent them to the great temple of Athena on the Acropolis at Athens. There, they would hang where all could see them, a visible sign that Greeks fighting under Macedonian leadership had struck deep into the empire that had once burned their shrines. An inscription made the point even sharper, stressing that these trophies came from Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, with one famous city-state pointedly excluded. Even in victory, old rivalries were kept alive. Inside Asia Minor, local lords and Greek communities now had a choice to make. Some coastal cities, protected by strong walls and Persian garrisons, hesitated. Others saw which way the wind was blowing. They opened their gates, expelled or handed over the king's officials, and welcomed Alexander as a liberator. In those places, he confirmed local laws, respected traditional cults, and left small garrisons behind. This gave him friendly harbors and fresh supplies without the need to storm every city. Yet the war was not over, and Persian resistance did not vanish overnight. Memnon of Rhodes, who had survived the Granicus, withdrew with experienced troops to strongholds further south. From there, he began to use the one advantage Persian power still held: its navy. Fleets loyal to the great king still ruled much of the sea. They could threaten the islands, raid Greek coasts, and stir trouble in Alexander's rear if given the chance. The struggle for control of Asia Minor would not be decided by one clash on a riverbank, but by a chain of sieges, naval moves, and political deals. Alexander moved methodically along the western coast. Each step tightened the net around Persian influence. Cities that resisted faced siege and possible plunder. Those that chose submission were treated far more gently. This blend of iron and velvet was deliberate. The young king wanted to frighten his enemies and tempt the undecided at the same time. After the terror of Thebes and the shock of Granicus, many communities judged that resistance was no longer worth the risk. Behind the marching columns, the administrative machine he had brought with him went to work. New satraps replaced old ones. Some were Macedonians or Greeks. Others were locals who had quickly shifted their loyalty. Tax systems were adjusted rather than destroyed. Officials like Eumenes made sure that tribute, grain, and pay continued to flow. Alexander was not just slashing at the empire's edges. He was beginning to plug his own rule into its veins. The army itself, hardened by the battle and heartened by its success, pushed on with growing confidence. Soldiers who had once feared the reputation of Persian cavalry now joked that they had seen those famous riders break and run. The phalangites trusted their long sarissai and close ranks as never before. The hypaspists prided themselves on being used wherever the ground or situation demanded flexible, tough infantry. Above all, the companions had proved that a carefully aimed cavalry charge, led by the king in person, could crack even a numerically superior foe. But beneath the pride ran a darker current. Many veterans could not forget the slaughter of the Greek mercenaries after the main battle. Some approved, saying that men who fought for the great king against their own kind had earned their fate. Others felt uneasy, knowing how easily fortune could have put them in the same position on another field. Alexander himself seemed to learn from the experience. Never again in the campaign would he be quite so ruthless with surrendered Greek units. The lesson of the Granicus cut both ways. In the wider Greek world, reactions were mixed. Allies of Macedon, especially those who had hated Persian interference in their politics, celebrated the victory. Public sacrifices were offered. Poets began to compose lines praising the young conqueror. In cities where anti-Macedonian factions still lingered, the news landed differently. They saw that the man they had once dismissed as an upstart boy had now proved himself a formidable war leader. Plots that had seemed tempting when he first took the throne now felt far more dangerous. Meanwhile, far from the smoking fields and captured treasuries of Asia Minor, Darius III at last began to stir. For the great king, the defeat at the Granicus was a humiliation, but not yet a mortal wound. The empire he ruled stretched far inland, across deserts, mountains, and rich river valleys. Its reserves of men and gold were vast. A satrapal army had been destroyed, true, and valuable nobles had fallen. Yet these were, in his eyes, losses on the frontier, not at the core. Now he would answer this challenge in person. Messengers went out from the royal court in all directions. Vassal kings, local dynasts, noble families, all were summoned to contribute troops. Levy lists were drawn up. Armorers worked day and night. Grain was stockpiled. The sound of hammers rang through arsenals as chariots and weapons were prepared. Darius meant to gather a host that would outmatch the Macedonians not by a small margin, but by a crushing one. When he met Alexander, it would be with an army that seemed to fill the horizon. Alexander, for his part, understood that the next phase of the war would be harder. Satrapal forces could be surprised and beaten in places like the Granicus. A royal army commanded by Darius himself would be a different matter. He needed secure bases along the coast, firm control of the western provinces, and a fleet strong enough, or a strategy clever enough, to neutralize Persian sea power. Each city taken, each satrap turned, each garrison placed, was a step toward that goal. Yet he also knew that time was not entirely on his side. The longer he remained in Asia Minor, the more chances his enemies had to regroup. In Greece, discontent could smolder. In Macedonia, ambitious nobles might resent his long absence. He had staked his throne on this war. Only continuous success would keep his realm united behind him. The victory at the Granicus had bought him breathing space and prestige, but it had also raised expectations. The boy who had once needed to prove himself had now set a standard he had to match again and again. So, as he looked east from his new vantage points, Alexander saw not just conquered cities and humbled satraps, but a path lined with greater tests. From the banks of the Granicus to the plains where Darius would one day stand in person, the line of his campaign was already beginning to take shape. The first shield of the Achaemenid Empire had shattered under his spear. Ahead, deeper in the continent, the King of Kings was forging another, larger shield and drawing it up across Alexander's road. Every victory at the edge of the empire bent the road toward a greater collision still to come. In the months after 334 BC, the battle at the Granicus became more than a clash on a map. It turned into a story that men told around campfires and in crowded marketplaces. For Macedonian soldiers, it was proof that the army Philip II had built, and Alexander now led, could stand toe-to-toe with the forces of the great king and win. For many Greeks, it showed that the old terror of Persia, born in the days of Marathon and Salamis, could finally be turned back against its maker. Alexander helped shape that story with care. When messengers went out from his camp, they were not carrying a dry report. They spoke of the king leading the companions through the river first, of the satraps cut down at close quarters, of the mercenaries punished for selling their spears to a foreign master. They spoke of trophies raised, honors given, and cities taken without siege because Persian officials had lost the will to resist. Each detail fed his image as a man favored by the gods and guided by destiny. At the same time, scribes and historians like Callisthenes began to fix the memory of the Granicus in writing. They described Alexander's shining armor and fearless advance in tones that echoed Homer. The king himself encouraged such echoes. He compared himself openly to Achilles and sometimes invoked other heroes as well. In these stories, the Granicus became his first great trial, the moment when the young warrior proved worthy of the legend he wished to inhabit. Inside the army, the lessons of the battle were discussed in more practical terms. Officers had seen how dangerous it was to force a defended river, yet they had also seen the value of speed and surprise. They noted how the sacrificial vanguard, thrown into the water first, had unhinged the neat Persian line. They saw how the wedge of Companion Cavalry, striking obliquely and then turning into the enemy flank, could shatter a larger force if it hit at just the right point. They saw how the phalanx, slow but relentless, turned an initial breakthrough into a general collapse. Over time, these observations hardened into habits. Alexander's commanders became more confident in combined arms tactics. They knew that the phalanx alone could hold ground, but that real decision came when cavalry, light troops, and elite infantry worked together. The Granicus served as a living blueprint. When they later faced Darius on wider plains and in more elaborate deployments, the memory of that first hour on the riverbank would shape their choices. The Persians also drew lessons from the defeat, though not all of them were helpful. At court, some blamed the satraps at Zelea for rejecting Memnon's plan. Others muttered that Darius had erred by letting frontier governors fight alone instead of sending royal troops from the start. Rumors moved down the long roads that tied the empire together. In some places, Local rulers began to wonder whether their distant overlord was as invincible as tradition claimed. In others, fear of the king's anger pushed officials to overcompensate, cracking down hard on any hint of disloyalty. One of the most important changes was a subtle shift in how Darius viewed the war. Before the Granicus, Alexander might have seemed like just another ambitious Western prince, dangerous but containable. After that day, he became a threat to the very prestige of the throne. The great king could no longer leave the fighting to satrapal coalitions and mercenary captains. His own presence would be required, with all the splendor and symbolism that entailed. This shift had practical consequences. A royal army meant more troops, but also more rigid planning. Logistics for such a host were immense. Every step had to be measured. Messages had to travel between distant provincial capitals and the central court. Orders issued in haste could create confusion months later in some mountain valley or river plain. As Darius pulled resources inward to form his great shield, outer provinces like the ones Alexander had just entered were left with fewer fresh troops and less direct support. Alexander tried to exploit that breathing space. Moving along the coast and then inland, he picked his targets with care. Some cities, like Sardis, fell into his hands without a fight. Others required sieges and sharp displays of force. Each new success chipped away at Persian authority and gave him more secure bases for the march ahead. Where possible, he presented himself as the protector of local customs and temples. Only those who resisted openly felt the full weight of Macedonian steel. All the while, he kept one eye on Greece and Macedon. Antipater's letters told him of shifting moods among the cities and noble families. There were still men who remembered the days before Philip II's reforms, who resented Macedonian power and dreamed of breaking free. A single serious defeat in Asia could bring their hopes roaring back. The Granicus had silenced many critics, but not all of them. Alexander knew that he was fighting not only for conquest, but for the security of his own throne. In private moments, he may also have reflected on how close the river battle had come to ending his story before it truly began. The accounts of Spithridates raising his sword for a killing blow and Cleitus the Black cutting that arm away would have been retold again and again, both in his hearing and behind his back. To some it proved that he was a chosen instrument of fate, snatched from death at the last instant. To others it hinted at dangerous recklessness. In later years, these two views of Alexander, divinely favored hero and impetuous risk-taker, would grow stronger and come into conflict. For now, in 334 BC, the mood in his camp was one of rising confidence. The men had marched far from home, crossed a sea, and beaten their first major enemy. They had watched satraps fall and heard of great cities surrendering without a fight. They believed, more than ever, that following Alexander would bring them glory, plunder, and a place in history. Beyond their circle of campfires, the world shifted. In Greek theaters, actors might now speak his name with a note of awe. In small Anatolian villages, people whispered that the old order was cracking. In distant eastern capitals, officials sent cautious questions back to court, asking whether this northern invader was a passing storm or the beginning of a new age. The answer would only come with time and more bloodshed. The Granicus was the first pillar of Alexander's legend, but not the largest. Ahead lay pitched battles on a much grander scale, against armies far greater than any satrap could muster alone. In 333 BC, at a narrow coastal plain near Issus, he would meet Darius III face to face for the first time. Then, in 391 BC, on the wide fields near a place called Gaugamela, their struggle would reach a second, even more decisive peak. Compared to those coming storms, The river at the Granicus was a small, early surge, yet without it, the flood that followed could never have begun. Those later storms at Issus and Gaugamela would rise from choices made in the quieter days that followed the Granicus. In the wake of his first great victory in Asia, Alexander did not allow his army to dissolve into drunken celebration. There were feasts, of course. There were songs and stories and cups raised to the fallen. But the king's eye remained fixed on the road ahead. He ordered damaged armor repaired, horses reshod, and units reorganized so that every taxius, every cavalry squadron, stood ready for the next march. Veterans who had distinguished themselves on the riverbank were promoted. Younger officers saw that courage in the line could lift a man quickly in Alexander's service. He also paid careful attention to local feeling. In towns that chose to submit, the Macedonian king made a point of visiting temples, sacrificing to both Greek and local gods, and confirming long-standing rites. Priests and elders who had feared harsh treatment found instead a conqueror who spoke of restoring freedom to Greek cities long under Persian shadow. This was not just kindness. It was policy. Every polis that opened its gates willingly gave him food, money, and harbor space without the cost in blood that a storming would demand. Where resistance continued, Alexander showed a different face. Cities that tried to hold out behind Persian garrisons were ringed with trenches, walls, and siege engines. Stone shot and bolts hammered their defenses. If they fell by force after refusing reasonable terms, the lesson was sharp. Some defenders were sold, others killed, their leaders punished in public. News of each harsh reprisal traveled as fast as news of his mercy. Between the two, many communities decided that opening the gates was the wisest course. Within his own ranks, Alexander knew he had to manage more than just supply and pay. The army was a living mesh of loyalties and rivalries. Macedonians, Thessalians, Thracians, Greek allies, hired mercenaries. Each group had its own pride. Officers like Parmenion, who had fought under Philip II, sometimes looked askance at the king's hunger for risk. Younger men, closer to Alexander in age and spirit, admired his personal daring and wanted to copy it. The Granicus had given him authority in both camps, but he still had to balance them. He did so by sharing glory while keeping the central role. Official accounts of the battle named squadron leaders and infantry commanders who had fought well. Rewards were spread widely enough that many could feel included. At the same time, the stories always returned to the same image, the king at the head of the companions, riding first into danger. That image, repeated in speech and later in sculpture and painting, drew the army together around a single, brilliant point. Far away, in the heartlands of the Achaemenid Empire, Darius III began to feel the pull of that image as well, though in a very different way. The defeat on the Granicus had not broken his rule. The tribute still arrived. The great roads still thrummed with caravans. Local kings still sent gifts. Yet a crack had opened in the polished surface of royal invincibility. A young foreign king had killed satraps, captured cities, and now sat in the strongholds that once guarded the empire's western door. Some of Darius's counselors urged immediate, overwhelming retaliation. Others advised a more patient approach, pointing out that time and distance might wear the Macedonians down. The great king chose a path that tried to combine both. He would gather a royal army on a scale to dwarf Alexander's force. When that host moved, it would do so carefully, but with the promise of a final, crushing encounter. The fact that such a gathering would take months, even years, was an unavoidable cost. In the space created by that delay, Alexander reshaped Asia Minor step by step. He secured the old royal road that ran inland, making sure that couriers and supply columns could move without constant ambush. he placed trusted men in key fortresses and at rich mines. Grain from fertile valleys began to feed his soldiers instead of Persian troops. Silver and gold that once flowed east toward the royal treasury now fed Macedonian pay chests and funded new siege engines. At the same time, he began to learn the geography and politics of the lands beyond. Envoys came to his camp from distant tribes and small kingdoms that lay between his present position and the inner provinces of the empire. Some offered their spears, others sought guarantees of safety. Each meeting gave Alexander and his staff fresh information: which passes were safe in winter, which rivers flooded in spring, which towns could be counted on, and which might turn at the first rumor of a Persian counterattack. The memory of the Granicus was always present in these dealings, sometimes spoken, sometimes just felt. Those who had heard of the battle knew that this was not a raiding force that would burn a few villages and go home. It was an army that crossed seas, smashed the first line of defense, and stayed. To some local rulers, that was terrifying. To others, it was an opportunity. If the Macedonians really meant to stay, then backing them early might bring new honors when the old masters fell. For Alexander himself, the battle on the river became a touchstone in another, more personal way. He had staked his life more openly there than at any previous fight. The near-fatal blade of Spithridates and the saving stroke of Cleitus showed how thin the line could be between heroic risk and needless death. Friends and generals sometimes urged him, in private, to be more careful. The king listened, but the lesson he drew was not to stand further back. Instead, he refined the way he took risks, choosing moments when his presence at the point of impact would most inspire his men and most unsettle his foes. As the months slipped by, the name of the Granicus shifted from daily news to part of a growing legend. New battles and sieges gave the storytellers fresh material, but that first major clash in Asia kept its special place. It was the moment when Alexander proved that his ambition was more than talk, that his army could break the first ring of Persian defense, and that the balance of power around the Aegean had begun to tilt. When, in the next year, the Macedonian king marched toward the narrow lands near Issus, he did so from a very different position than the bold but untested prince who had once stood on the European shore of the Hellespont. Behind him now lay Sardis and the other conquered cities of Western Asia Minor, a string of bases and allies anchored by the memory of victory on a small, fast-flowing river. Ahead of him, gathering his strength and prestige, waited Darius III. The road from the Granicus had led Alexander closer to the heart of the empire he challenged, and closer to the moment when the great king himself would ride out to meet him.